Heather's been talking about the history of reading with our fingers. Now I'm going to talk about reading with our ears. I'm standing next to a talking book record player. Now, a talking book was any narrative read aloud by an actor or someone else onto a gramophone record. And this made it possible for people who weren't able to read with their eyes or with their fingers to still hear books read aloud. The first talking books were made in the 1930s, but the technology originated back during the First World War. Then, a number of veterans came back from the war having lost their eyesight, either through artillery fire or shrapnel or gas or other chemicals that damaged their eyesight. One of the key figures in this story is a man named Ian Fraser. He came back from the war after being shot through the eyes by a German sniper at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. When he got back to London, he joined a group called St. Dunstan's. That was a charity designed to help veterans who'd lost their sight in the war. Once there, he began tinkering with a number of sound recording machines to come up with a way to record books onto records. Now, before the 1930s, it was impossible to record a full-length book because records could only store a few minutes of speech. So they could maybe hold a couple minutes of poetry, a couple speeches from Shakespeare, but not an entire book. That changed in the 1930s when record companies came up with the technology to make a long playing record that could play for up to 25 minutes rather than just 3 or 4. So once that breakthrough happened, the Royal National Institute of Blind People in St. Dunstan's were able to start the talking book program. The first titles to go out to readers were Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Joseph Conrad's Typhoon, and The Gospel According to John. Now, that last one's one of the titles that appeared in Heather's material. And the origins of the talking book program were very similar to the first embossed books, in that a lot of religious groups really wanted blind readers to be able to read the Bible for themselves. So again, people who couldn't read Braille, this was a way for them to be able to read for themselves instead of relying on other people to read to them. And only about 20% of people at this time could read, 20% of blind people at this time could read Braille. So that meant 80% of people still needed a way to read books for themselves. And this was crucial for blind readers who didn't want to depend on, say, family members or volunteers to read books to them. A lot of accounts I've come across are complaints about having to ask people to read a book to you, or concerns about privacy, say having to ask someone to read a book that's possibly risque or a bit racy, something you might be a bit embarrassed about having your mother read to you. So talking book technology sort of offered one solution to this problem. Now, I'm standing before an early gramophone. This is from the RNIB's collection, and it is from 1947. It looks a bit like a turntable and a suitcase, and in fact, it was designed to be portable. You could close it up and carry it around with you wherever you want to listen to books. Now, having spent some time traveling around London taking this talking book player to various exhibitions, I can tell you it's not that portable because it's very heavy, but you can see the idea. Now, a key thing to know about this record player is that it was designed for blind people to be able to operate it for themselves. So the needle here is missing, but the arm would have had a permanent needle, unlike many gramophones at the time where you often had to replace the needle. That was a fiddly little part, so it was much easier to have a permanent needle for when dealing with readers with vision impairments. And on the side, there is a crank, and you can wind it up, and then the spring-operated motor would play an entire side of a record. There were 3 different types of machines available. One could be plugged into electricity. Another could be operated without electricity. And many blind people at this time were out of work, were impoverished, and living without electricity, so that was quite important. And then there was a third model in which you could listen to talking books on headphones. So again, a key element in terms of ensuring the reader's privacy. On top of this turntable, we have one of the earliest talking books that was made, and one of the oldest surviving records out there. This is a copy of Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, and it's made on a 12-inch shellac record. Now, one thing I noticed by picking this record up is it's quite heavy and it's quite brittle, it's quite stiff because it's made of shellac. And that meant, unlike vinyl, it broke very easily. So one reason that a number of the earliest recordings no longer exist is because these records broke so easily. So I've spent a lot of time traveling around looking for early recordings over the last couple of years, and often when I find them, they're in pieces. Fortunately, we still have a couple early copies, and this is one of the earliest ones made. This was made in 1936, so the program's first year. And this record of Gaskell's novel was recorded by a man named Anthony MacDonald. He was the first reader of a talking book in Britain. And even though this isn't the first record made at that time, we can still hear what the first reader's voice sounded like. I'll play a recording in just 1 minute, but I'll mention that each of these records could hold up to 25 minutes, and the average novel would fit onto between 8 and 10 of these records. And these records could be shipped through the post in a sturdy container. Users didn't have to pay for records to be shipped through the mail. They only had to pay the cost of return postage. So I've been talking a bit about this technology's history and how they were made and shown an example of one of the records. Now we can listen to what this early record sounded like. So I'm going to play a recording now of Elizabeth Gaskell's Victorian novel Cranford, read by Anthony MacDonald.
Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Recorded for the Talking Book Library for the Blind. Read by Anthony MacDonald. Chapter 1. Our Society. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple come to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighbouring commercial town of Brumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were there? The surgeon has his round of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford, but every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed.
I'll stop the record there before everyone gets drawn into the narrative. So there's an example of what the first readers in the 1930s would have heard when they were listening to talking books. Now, the reactions I've encountered by readers range from enthusiasm at being able to read again. Some blind readers thought that would never happen, to the sense that the restoration of this ability to read was a miracle, an act of divine providence. There aren't many accounts of what people felt like at the time listening to talking books, but we do have a letter written in 1936 by a blinded veteran named F.G. Braithwaite. So he wrote the following account about how he used the technology. This is how I enjoy the talking book. Every night at about 10 o'clock, I shoot the wife off to bed, then make up the fire, draw my armchair near, and, after having got a bottle of Worthington and a cigarette going, I switch on the talking book. Don't you think this is real luxury? Not being able to sleep much and being very poor at Braille, you can imagine how useful the talking book is to me. Now, one thing that stands out to me when reading this letter is that the letter could be by just about anyone until that final line, when Braithwaite mentions not being able to sleep much. A lot of soldiers suffered from traumatic memories of trench warfare in France and had trouble sleeping at night. So the talking book was a technology that helped them rest. And also he mentions being poor at Braille. So many people who lose their sight in midlife struggle to learn a new language at that point. So even though he could read a little bit of Braille, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't very useful for recreational reading since it was hard work. So the talking book is a way for him to relax and enjoy domestic comforts at the same time.